wanted to let you know that this webinar is being recorded. I wanted to make sure you were aware of that, and so you know that you can share it with colleagues. We hope to have that ready and up soon so that we can share that with you. I wanted to take a second to thank Cassie Harrelson from the Colorado Education Association. Cassie, as you heard, is the Director of Professional Practice at Colorado Education Association, and they graciously paid for 5 of Dr. Coggins' books that we have to give away today to 5 lucky winners that are winning our door prizes today. So I wanted to take the second to thank you, Cassie, so much, and the Colorado Education Association for your support. I also want to introduce now Dr. Celine Coggins. Celine is the founder of Teach Plus. It's an advocacy organization to help empower teachers and teach teachers to advocate. She's also a lecturer at Harvard University in the Graduate School of Education, and also in their Entrepreneur in Residence program. She also currently is the executive director of Grantmakers for Education, and she graciously agreed to appear after Cassie suggested Dr. Coggins and her book. So I will turn it over to you now, as soon as I see how.
All right.
We practice this, so I for sure know.
Yes.
Make host.
All right. Can people see my slides? All right. Perfect. So thank you all for having me. This is really exciting. I wrote this book about a year and a half ago, right around a year and a half ago, at the conclusion of 10 years of working with teachers at Teach Plus and trying to make sense of one really important question. What do teachers need in order to be able to have a voice at the system level on the policies and practices that kind of affect their classroom that most often they don't have a voice in? And so for a lot of you who work in higher ed, I would say this was my attempt to say, if teachers had access to one book or one-hour lecture about how the system operates in which their classroom context plays out, what would we say to them? And so basically what I did with the book was try to say there are just 10 things you need to understand about how the system operates, and all of those get played out in your classroom. And if you want to change things, you need to understand that basic context. So let me keep moving through my slides. And what I want to do as I give this talk is a couple things. So number one, I want to encourage your participation. It's probably better if this is interactive. I also want to say that the way Zoom is, like that little bar, for those of you who do talks on Zoom, sometimes I'm sure there are plenty of you, like sometimes it goes away, and sometimes I miss like when your hand is up or if you've entered something in the chat box. So Karen and Britt know to interrupt me. That's number one. And then number two, I'm going to walk through this talk the way that I would if I were talking to one of your graduate school classes. Hopefully it's something that you might, adopt or adapt yourself. And so some of this may seem like, it's pitched more at teachers, but that's because it actually is. The book is very much kind of for a teacher audience. And so I'd love your feedback on that. I'd love your thoughts on how to make sure that it reaches teachers. But I just wanted to kind of give that as a preview. All right, now let me, okay. So what I like to start with is just a question. So can you describe in one sentence what policy is? And so for me, I'll say I had been a teacher. I had worked in policy. I worked for a state commissioner of education. And then I went to Stanford to do my doctorate. And I can say with 100% certainty, because I had lots of conversations with people, at the end of my doctorate, I could not describe what policy was in a sentence. Policy is a complex thing, and I had so many kind of in the weeds takes on what policy was, but I couldn't really define what it was. So would anyone like to give it a stab? And I think if you raise your hand, then Britt and Karen can give you the mic. Oh my gosh. And now I'm seeing that Cassie was a Teach Plus Fellow. Awesome. No one can define policy. You all are in the same boat that I was in when I was graduating from a policy program. Oh, there we go. I can't remember your book. Okay, good. So don't do that. Then we won't need to go through the talk. Okay. So I think that the point is clear. What happens is, oftentimes we'll have teachers try and give that a stab, and they'll get pieces of the puzzle and not others. Policy is legislation. Policy is court rulings. Policy is, all of the things that basically suck the joy out of teaching and make it a bureaucratic, horrible exercise where I'm filling in way too much paperwork. And so what I set out to do with the book is define policy around basically 3 terms, so that every teacher who walks away from reading the book or walks away from a 1-hour lecture by me can say, I know what policy is in 3 words. And to me, that's super important, because if you know what it is, if you know what you're going for, you're that much more likely to be able to influence it. Okay. Slide myself ahead. Okay. So a little bit about my personal story. So this is a picture of me when I was 7. I always wanted to be a teacher. I was the kid who was lining up my dolls to teach them math before I, knew math. This was me at age 7 getting a game about being a teacher, which you can see couldn't have been more excited to get that game. So that's my background. My parents were both teachers. When I told my parents at age 15 or 16, as I was starting to look at colleges, and they said, hey, so what do you think you want to be when you grow up? I told them that I wanted to become a teacher. And the reaction that I got was the polar opposite of what I thought I was going to get. So I thought they were going to say, wow, great. Welcome to the family business. We must have been really great role models for you to want to follow in our footsteps. There's nothing more important than teaching. And instead, my dad started yelling at me and my mom started crying, and they said, where did we go wrong? Please be anything but a teacher. Teaching is a hard life. The work is hard. You don't get paid well enough. All of those types of things that were just the hugest disappointment in my life, because, I knew teaching was the most important work there was, and I looked up to them for being teachers. And so right there, I feel like that was a really kind of pivotal space in my own development, to recognize that there was a gap between, kind of the best of what teaching was and what oftentimes actual practitioners think about the kind of rewards and trade-offs of the work.
And unfortunately, we've heard that story a lot, right?
Yes.
Bullard is the president of the CEA, and she tells the same story. And
Mm-hmm.
I remember talking about the look on her dad's face and she was so shocked because he was so visibly disappointed.
Yeah, I've had this conversation or done this talk, I'd say at this point, for about 3,500 teachers. Average room size is 20 teachers. There has never been a room that I've been in where there haven't been at least a couple of teachers who have raised their hand and said that's the same story as my story. And so that's this heartbreaking systemic problem, because for so many of us, when we're in the classroom with our students, we say this is the best and most important work in the world. But there are so many pieces surrounding it, and I think you all, with the strikes in Colorado and strikes all around the country, we see the huge tensions that exist in the field and where it needs to go to be better. So I left teaching thinking, hey, after a few years, I kind of got to understand what my parents meant. I was teaching middle school. I loved it. And at the same time, I started to think, geez, there's no kind of path for me to stay in the classroom with kids and also be able to become a leader. So I thought, hey, I think I'm having an impact on my classroom. And so why don't I get into policy so I can have an even bigger impact? So I went to work for a state Department of Education. I went to work for the commissioner in Massachusetts, and I learned a whole bunch of things. Number one, that you might have impact over more people, but that impact is incredibly indirect. And so, I really missed the classroom. I also started to understand some of the constraints around decision making. So I was at a state Department of Education. There were all sorts of, federal rules that we had to follow. And so, so the decisions that affected teachers' classrooms that teachers had an opinion on, there were constraints about how would you set up a conversation so teachers could actually give meaningful and useful feedback to, say, a state commissioner of education or a legislature. So I started to recognize those kinds of gaps and think, geez, there's an opportunity for someone to help bridge that gap between teachers and the people who make decisions about their classrooms. So that kind of was percolating for me. I went to graduate school and had this experience of kind of like talking through teacher leadership and getting a lot of validation that there were, some things, some gaps in the system that might be addressed. And so when I came back from graduate school, I moved back to Massachusetts and said, let me try to shape an organization that could, number one, that basically could elevate teacher leadership, elevate teaching as a profession. And so I founded Teach Plus in 2007. So the idea behind the organization was just to empower teachers to take more leadership over the issues of policy and practice that affected their classrooms. So Teach Plus had kind of two tracks. I think the more prominent and better known, and the one that I spent more of my time on, was the policy track. So we take great teachers. Teach Plus works in 12 states now, including Colorado. And what we do is we run them through a year-long, sometimes even longer fellowship. And the components of that are, number one, we treat it like a graduate level class. We expose you to research and writing on teacher quality and research and writing on some of the things that are happening in the field, best practices from other states and things like that. The second piece is we connect you to some of the leaders. We demystify this kind of, who is your state legislator? Who is your state, commissioner of education? Why don't you come meet them in so they come in and talk to teachers in a group of 20 in their sessions. And then the third piece is they work on their own advocacy projects. So, advocating for additional state funding, advocating for changes to testing, advocating for other things that kind of affect the professionalism of teaching. And so that's the policy side. We also work with teachers who are interested in supporting the development of other teachers. So they're teacher leaders in their schools, they're teacher leaders in their districts, running professional development for other teachers. So that's the idea behind that. I was at Teach Plus for 10 years exactly, from 2007 to 2017. At that point, Roberto Rodriguez, who had been Obama's advisor in the White House, took over as the head of Teach Plus. For me, it was a kind of a natural chapter end. I think that some organizations end up suffering from founder syndrome because they end up, having a founder who's there kind of without fresh ideas anymore. And so I went back to teaching at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. I'm doing some work thinking about networks and philanthropy the way I was thinking about networks and teaching and, how to help them to, kind of be their most beneficial to students. So that's my kind of story of my background. Any questions or comments there? I'm glad to see that other people have this experience of, oh yes, and so Mark Sass is the head of Teach Plus in Colorado. If you have not met Mark, he is just a fantastic resource. He is the most authentic version of what a teacher leader is, close to the classroom, also working kind of outside the classroom, has great connections, just great, incredibly thoughtful. So if you don't know Mark, you should. All right. Let me move on. Okay, so what I want to do, so the book that I wrote is broken into 10 chapters. As I said, really intended to say to teachers, if there are 10 things you need to know about the system, here's what they are. And what I want to do is just read them off and then pause for a minute. We're going to go into depth on each of these, but for right now, what I want to do is kind of read them off and then do a little preview, ask some questions about, are any of these surprising to you? Do any of these kind of provoke you in any way? Because they're intended to be a little bit provocative. So my lessons are, number one, there are no experts. Number two, the policies that affect our classrooms are not random. Number three, bilingualism is the price of admission to policymaking. Number four, equity is everything and nothing. Number five, is it good for kids is the wrong question. Number six, accountability is inescapable. Number seven, and we're going to get more into detail on this, my three words, effective policy advocates think inside the triangle. Number eight, there is no such thing as one best policy for all. Number nine, entry points are hidden in plain sight. And number 10, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. Does anyone have anything that stands out to them among these? I might go back to the first page, that they're interested to hear more about, that infuriates them, anything of that ilk. I think I see no hands and no.
So Cassie, this is Britt, and one of the things that I was thinking about is the one about bilingualism. I like where you talk about, and I know you're going to talk about it more, yeah. But I think that really is the key, is being able to know the policy speak, yeah, and the education speak, because we often know that our policymakers only know policy. Mm-hmm. That's often a frustration, but just a great avenue for educators to learn both, so they can help bridge that gap.
Yeah, yes, and I think just kind of breaking that down and saying there are people who have different training and different background. We'll talk about this. Helps people to understand that just telling the super important story from your classroom might not be enough to motivate action. How do you tie that to what's going on at the system level in a way that allows a legislator who's speaking a different language to actually connect?
We also have, Celine, in the chat box.
Yeah.
We have Valerie asking about number one, just curious about number one, and then Jeremiah asking about number 5, why that's the wrong question. Yeah. I think the other thing I would just add, I was going to type, is I feel like there's a lesson in that because everyone's gone to school, everyone thinks they're the expert. And that really, I can't stand that. And that happens all the time. And so I don't know where that fits, and maybe that's in here somewhere, embedded in one of your things, but I also just wanted to say that part.
Yeah. I think that one is a huge one, and it's a frustration because you have, so say you have a state legislator, right? So they haven't been in a classroom like yours ever, probably. They haven't been in a classroom in 30 years, and yet they say, I don't need to hear from teachers. I was in a classroom every day for 12 years, and so I get it. I know what public school is like. And I think that's a real disadvantage for us. I will talk a little bit more about number one, but I will tell you that I have plenty of colleagues at Harvard who do not love that I start with that and would argue vehemently that there are experts. So I'll tell you my take on that. And I'm sure there are some people in the audience who say, I'm an expert. So number 5 is good for kids is the wrong question. Yes. So I think this is the one that teachers always point out and say, this is what I thought. I thought policymakers didn't care about students. And and it's sad. This one is sad. I hope that by the end of my explanation of that one, you all say, not only is that not sad, it's good. But I know it's going to take me a minute to get you there. Okay, so let's move on to the first one and talk a little bit about there are no experts. So when I talk about this, I like to start with the story of the blind men and the elephant. When I ask if teachers know this story, I would say about a third do, many don't. I'm going to assume that most in this audience do, but if you don't, the story of the blind men and the elephant is, picture 3 or 4 blind men touching different parts of an elephant, right? So someone's touching the big wall of the belly and saying, it's a wall. And someone else is touching the trunk at the bottom and saying, it's moist and malleable. and someone else is touching a huge sloped toenail and saying, you know, it's like hard like a rock, and someone else is touching the tail and saying it feels like a rope. So in each case, the person is telling the truth. In each case, the person is reporting exactly their full experience. And in each case, the person doesn't have kind of every piece of the puzzle, right? And so I'll say, as someone who has a PhD in education policy, who's been working in this field for 25 years, who has been called an expert kind of more times than I can count, I don't believe there are people who are experts in education. I believe there are folks who are experts in the way budgets work. There are folks who are expert in the connections between federal law and how those play out at the state level. There are people who are experts in curriculum. There are people who are experts in, you know, technology and education. And then there's kind of one other really important set of experts who need to be at the table. They don't have expertise in everything, but they have expertise in implementation, in policy implementation. And so when I talk about the people who are expert in policy implementation, who am I talking about? Anyone want to raise their hand? Or anyone want to type it in the chat box? So it's teachers, right? So teachers have a really important expertise that, so I'm trying to like bounce around a little bit with pulling down the participants so that I can see if you're raising your hands and looking in the chat. And so sometimes I'm going to land myself on the wrong slide. I apologize. So you know, the point here is just that that what we hear from teachers most often is, I can't participate in policy because I don't know enough. And I think what's important to tell teachers is everyone has expertise and everyone has blind spots. And so you have expertise in the way policy gets implemented for students, and you have blind spots about some of the other aspects of the policymaking process. So learn, recognize your blind spots, but also recognize that you shouldn't be intimidated to get into a room of policymakers, because you have something they need, and there's no other way to get to good policy than having the implementation experts at the table as well. So that's slide 1, or point 1. So number 2 is policies are not random. So when you talk to teachers, and for those of you who have been in the classroom in the past, we all have that experience of getting the email or getting the slip in our physical mailbox in the central office, or getting some dictate from on high in a professional development that makes you say, whoever made this decision has never been a teacher, hates kids, hates teachers, right? We all have had this experience. The things that filter down to teachers oftentimes do not make sense in the context of real day-to-day classroom life, whether it be just another layered on test, or another layered on kind of expectation to fill out paperwork, or whatever it is, a change to the curriculum that you just changed from 2 years ago. When those things happen to teachers, they feel like the people who are making the decisions are crazy and don't care about them and don't have any understanding of their context. And what I say to teachers is, it's really important to recognize that and kind of give people the benefit of the doubt. There aren't people who go into education really at any level saying, what I want to do is screw teachers and kids. And the more you can try to unpack or peel back, what was it that kind of led us to where we are now, the more you're going to be able to kind of figure out where to push for change and where to kind of let things alone. So I think a really great example is the Common Core. So the Common Core ended up becoming this thing that got really kind of tied in a negative way to testing, to kind of federal overreach in education. But it started in a fairly natural and innocuous place, which was as we started to look across the states, we saw that we had different expectations for kids learning that advantaged kids in some states, like my home state of Massachusetts, over kids in other states where they had to, where they were learning things, several years behind in some cases. And so that's a good place for teachers to say, okay, what problem were policymakers trying to solve? And then how do we filter in to make sure that we have an opportunity to make sure that as they're trying to solve that problem, they're solving it in ways that are going to work in our classrooms in Colorado or in Massachusetts. And so I think there's too often the kind of shutting down and skepticism among teachers that the policies are just made by crazy people, and that creates gaps where we want to try to bridge those gaps. Any questions or comments there? Okay. All right. Let's move on to number 3. All right. So this is a place for audience participation. I know just about everyone in this call has been a teacher. So anything that you can put in the chat box. What are the things that keep teachers up at night? I'm going to practice a little wait time here. Yes, kids struggling for sure. Yep, kids who have who are going to difficult home environments for sure. Lesson planning, grading, concerns with students, parents, too much company, absolutely. Not enough time in the day, absolutely. Meeting with all the various needs that are present with the resources and time available. Yeah, so, again, I've done this talk and I've kind of like whiteboarded with literally thousands of teachers in different chunks of time. Every time you end up getting to the same kind of 3 core issues. So kind of at the top of the pyramid always for teachers is individual students. So every single one of us who's taught goes to bed at night, and the last thought in our brain, the little like bubble over our heads as we're falling asleep, is about some kid that on that day you did not do enough for, you wished you could have, and it just wasn't possible. And so those individual students and their needs dominate the thoughts of all teachers. Another contributor to that is that if you're a teacher, you never have enough time, right? This is very different from those of us who have moved into the policy space. I have never said in my policy life, I can't go to the bathroom during the day. That was like kind of a thing that was definitely the case when I was a teacher. And then last is just that there are lots of things that factor into our school day and our classroom experience that come from the outside world. Those are, students who have chaotic home environments, students who come to school hungry. It might be the fact that those of us who are teachers, in 2019 are not making enough money to make our own, ends meet. And so all of those outside factors play into the experience in a classroom. And so if I'm a teacher, at any given time, I've got these 3 balls in the air, right? And I'm trying to juggle them. And if I'm doing good on any given day, that's great teaching. And I also know that I'm going to, I'll probably drop one of those balls by tomorrow. And so that fundamental experience of what is hard about teaching is quite different than the triangle of kind of policymakers' concerns and what is difficult about policy. So let me see. So yes, and how to pay the mortgage. Teachers in Pueblo can still buy a 3-bedroom house in Pueblo for $135 and make a decent middle-class lifestyle. So this is a huge issue right now in teaching, right? So there are places in the country where you can live on a teacher's salary quite comfortably. And it sounds like even within Colorado. And then there are places within Colorado and within, the country at large where you can't live on a teacher's salary. I think this issue of teacher compensation is really hard. I met with a group of teachers in the Boston area very recently, and we were talking about the strikes and how, you know, to me, this is like this really important bellwether. Teachers are playing a really important role in saying, you know, in a lot of places, our schools just fundamentally are not adequately funded for the job. And so the Boston teachers were like, yeah, should we fight for more funding? And I was like, no, Boston teachers are some of the highest compensated in the country. But Massachusetts schools are some of the best funded in the country. And so this really is a kind of place-to-place kind of issue. So yeah, not the same as in Aspen, obviously. So, all right. Isn't it that about 77% of districts in Colorado average teacher pay is below the cost? So that makes sense. And I think that's probably roughly what it is across the country. It's just that it's super uneven as to, you know, where are the places where teachers can live comfortably and where are they not. All right, so we have a level setting on teachers now and what is hard about the job of teaching. All right, so now what I want to do is start to move into kind of an illustration of these different languages and what it means to be bilingual in teaching. So we know what keeps teachers up at night. We're going to start to move toward, you know, how does that play out? And how does that look differently when teachers talk about schools compared to when policymakers talk about schools and the way they think about what's hard about their work. All right, so this is Pearl Ardondo. Pearl, at the time of this TED Talk, was a fifth-year teacher. She was a policy fellow in Los Angeles and had grown up in Los Angeles. We're just going to watch her for a minute, but what I ask you to do is, and you can be doing this in the chat box as she talks or afterward, just pick up on some of the language that she uses. It's very powerful.
So I grew up in East Los Angeles, not even realizing I was poor. My dad was a high-ranking gang member who ran the streets. Everyone knew who I was, so I thought it was a pretty big deal. And I was protected. And even though my dad spent most of my life in and out of jail, I had an amazing mom who was just fiercely independent. She worked at the local high school as a secretary in the dean's office. So she got to see all the kids that got thrown out of class for whatever reason who were waiting to be disciplined. Man, her office was packed. So see, kids like us, we have a lot of things to deal with outside of school. And sometimes we're just not ready to focus. But that doesn't mean that we can't. It just takes a little bit more. Like, I remember one day I found my dad convulsing, foaming at the mouth, ODing on the bathroom floor. Really? Do you think that doing my homework that night was at the top of my priority list? Not so much. But I really needed a support network, a group of people who were going to help me make sure that I wasn't going to be a victim of my own circumstance, that they were going to push me beyond what I even thought I could do. I needed teachers.
Okay. So what were some of the things that you picked up on that Pearl said? So again, Pearl's a fifth-year teacher talking about kind of what is most important to her when she thinks about teachers and the teaching profession.
This is Britt, and I was really struck by, and we hear this a lot from kids, especially kids in need, about priorities, you know, and when you're hungry or scared or, you know, worried about your dad on the floor, yeah, education isn't, you know, at the top of your list, and understandably so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, school is about, what you're bringing to school is about so much more than, you know, just what presents in the classroom. What else? That she needed a supportive adults in her life. She needed opening up possibilities that weren't on her radar. These are some in the chat box. What would you say is, when Pearl thinks of school, what would you say is kind of the most important thing that goes on at school? She needed a place that was safe and predictable, supports outside of school, positive activities, that kind of thing. When you think about Pearl's approach as a teacher, What do you think she prioritized more than anything else? Yes, I like that one. Lack of focus did not mean lack of ability. Okay, so yeah, so relationships, in my mind, what she's talking about there, what you can see is why she went into teaching, what she thinks is most important. It's all about relationships, those relationships that got her through her experience. And then, what's so fascinating is she's a 5th-year teacher there. So she's at least 10 years out of high school herself. And one of the phrases she uses is kids like us. So she identifies so closely with her kids that she's still saying that even though she's 10 years out. So yeah, the network of supports, the relationships, all of that, being able to be an advocate for herself and her kids. But I think what I hear in her language is just, really relationship based. All right, so now same thing, I'm going to give you an example of the language of policy. Like him or not, you know him. And again, I'm going to ask you to take down some examples of the type of language and how this might be a little different from Pearl.
Here at Graham Road, they're using innovative approaches to provide effective teaching to all their students. And that's something that all of America's schools have to do. As I said before, there are any number of actions we can take as a nation to enhance our competitiveness and secure a better future for our people, but few of them will make as much of a difference as improving the way we educate our sons and daughters. Offering our children an outstanding education is one of our most fundamental, perhaps our most fundamental obligation as a country. And whether we meet that obligation not only reflects who we are as Americans, it will shape our future as a nation. Countries that out-educate us today will outcompete us tomorrow, and I refuse to let that happen on my watch. Now, it's clear that doing the same old things will not get the job done for our kids, or for America, or for our future. So when I took office, I asked Arne Duncan to work with states and local school districts to take on business as usual in our education system. And that's how the Race to the Top competition was born last July. It's a national competition among states to improve our schools. Over the past few months, we've seen such a positive response that today I'm announcing our intention to make a major new investment, more than $1.3 billion in this year's budget to continue the race to the top.
All right. So let's see in the chat box or where people are unmuted if they raise their hand. What are some of the language pieces that you heard in here? So this is another person who cares about education, talking about improving education. Extremely, extremely different language, but I think quite representative of the way policymakers talk. Education is fundamental and shapes our future, certainly.
I just want to remind folks too, you can unmute yourself if you'd like to just speak with Celine.
Thanks.
There. Okay, I just want to, it's Valerie. I didn't want to step over everybody's toes and unmute myself. Thanks for that, Britt. But, I think that Obama has a great point, but he also seems to think that just throwing a lot of money at the situation certainly is it's going to have an impact, but it's not going to be the, not the entire solve.
Yes. And a little bit of context here. So, and this context is going to matter for the next place that we're going. But so this was 2010. It was shortly before the midterms in 2010, but only a year after the stimulus package, which had the first round of Race to the Top and billions of dollars kind of straight to districts to basically prop them up as the recession hit its depth. And so a lot of what's going on here is the federal government seeing a need to throw money at states and districts so that they didn't have to just massacre their schools. So yes, there's some throwing money at the problem. We know that Race to the Top had a number of kind of challenges to it, not the least of which was basically we're going to make you do these things that the feds want, or you're not going to get your money. But put that aside a little bit, and let's keep working on, what are the ways that he talks about students and schools? Business as usual. Yes. So one of the things that I think is the most, like, such a good phrase in here that is indicative of the way policymakers think is, he says, it's clear that doing the same old things won't get the job done. He really kind of rejects this notion of business as usual. Now, if this is 2010, what was business as usual? What's the business as usual that he's rejecting? Does anyone remember? You all know. But oftentimes teachers don't. I can tell you all lived it. It's No Child Left Behind. So what he's trying to do is move us away from No Child Left Behind and say, basically, George Bush had a solution on education. We all hate it. We need to move away from there. I want to be the education president. I know that George Bush tried it, but let's just say his idea didn't work, right? And so what he's trying to do here is do what policymakers do, right? How do I know that I'm getting the affirmation for my agenda? Well, if, this is just before the 2010 midterms, he wants to see Democrats win in the 2010 midterms. He's making a push for vote for Democrats. Democrats recognize that this business as usual isn't working, that we have a new idea, it's shiny and it's better. Yes, so policy language equals, name a big federal initiative, a shiny new thing that says, we're trying to solve the education problems. My party is doing that, right? So that's what we see here. Do you think Pearl would agree with Race to the Top? Would she agree with this notion that business as usual is not a good thing in schools, and schools need to shake things up every few years with a new big federal or state initiative? No, right? She is, her big strategy, relationship building, is the strategy that goes all the way back to the ancient Greeks, right? This is the way that people have taught and learned. This is where we're tacking back to now with social and emotional learning, and recognizing that without relationships, kids are not going to learn from the teachers that they have. And so, so yeah, she's not focused. Well, she's not focused on nationwide goals. I get, like, it doesn't necessarily make sense for her, but I think the question really is, policymakers, because of their incentives, are thinking in terms of what's the next big thing that can get me reelected, get my agenda validated. And teachers are thinking about what's the stable, steady thing that we can be doing kind of consistently over time that is going to work for the most students. And so where that starts to then break down is, as you're a teacher, the kind of the lever that you have to change the system is relationships. So if I'm a teacher and I want to, reach a kid better, I'm going to have a conversation with them. I'm going to reach out to their parents. I might strategize with other teachers. I might even go to the principal and think about, what are some things that we can do at the school level, because this kid and probably other kids are being left behind. Those are not the levers that that folks in the policy space can have. If I'm in the policy space and I say, I really want to improve education, I have a different set of tools. And they really are different. When you hear President Obama talking in that little clip, he talks about kids and our sons and daughters and students, but as he's talking, he doesn't have a picture of a kid in his head the way Pearl does. So what folks at the policy level have, they have legislation, they have regulation, they have budgets and contracts. By definition, kind of policy begins where relationships end. If I'm a superintendent, I can't have a relationship unless it's a very, very small district with all of the kids in my district. If I'm a teacher, even if I'm a teacher with a really large class size at a high school, I know every single one of those kids. I might aspire to know some of them better, but that's where kind of the gap starts to begin. And then in terms of personal success, if I'm a teacher, I know every day by the looks on my kids' faces whether I'm successful or not. And that's what I take as my validation. If I'm a policymaker, I'm always thinking about reelection and reappointment. That, that kind of indirect sense of whether you're being successful. And so my incentives are all aligned toward trying new things, introducing new ideas, and trying to be, the person who rescues us from the last guy who was in the other political party. Let's see, any comments there? I have to reopen my chat box. Okay, all right. Now let's move on. There are a couple of other things. You all know this. So the knowledge base, when you are a practitioner, when you train as a teacher. So I did analysis when I was writing the book. I looked at a few different universities, and in their graduate schools of education, they had both a master's in teaching and a master's in policy. You might guess this, but the overlap in required coursework was exactly 0. So, so if I'm training to be a teacher, I might be walking past another student every day who's also getting their master's in the Graduate School of Education, but they're being trained in a whole different set of kind of disciplinary thinking and working. So, if I'm training in policy, I'm trying to understand the legal and financial rules governing the system level in education, thinking about policy, thinking about group dynamics, systems. If I'm a practitioner, it's about my subject matter. It's about classroom management, adolescent development, a little bit of research, but not the same type of research. And so then that takes us to kind of the pressures driving the work. So we talked about at the teacher level, the 3 main pressures are just recognizing all the time that individual students have needs that are greater than you can possibly, kind of address, that we always have to do that in limited time, and that there's a lot that pushes in from outside the classroom that influences our classrooms. If I'm a policymaker, my primary challenges are very different. And this is starting to get us to what are those 3 words in my mind, or 3 phrases that really define what policy is. And to me, when we look at the system level, there are 3 real kind of central issues and central questions that policymakers wrestle with. One is equity. So how do I make sure that that all kids get access to a good education? Second is resource scarcity. How do I make sure all kids get access to a good education, recognizing that I'll never have all the dollars that I need to do all the things we could do that are good for kids? And then third is accountability. So given my limited resources and the need to reach all kids with limited dollars, how do we know that we're investing in things that are working? So those are the challenges that kind of define the policymaker triangle. And we're going to talk a little bit more about each of those in more depth now. So let me open the chat box and see. I don't even know what FAPE is. Did I? Okay. All right. Well, okay. Oh, yes. Okay. Yes. Totally true. Totally fair. Okay. So what I want to do now is take up each of these 3 kind of areas: equity, resource scarcity, and accountability separately. So I say equity is everything and nothing. Does anyone have any guesses as to what that means? Any suggestions on that one? Equity does not mean equity in resources. Fair enough. We know that, I think the Ed Trust has great research on this, that there are massive gaps, even if you look at most states, more affluent districts still tend to get more dollars than less affluent districts. So, we're not even at a good baseline on equity for sure. Totally true. No one can say they're against equity explicitly. That's 100% true, and that's part of the problem. And this is one of the cautions that I give to teachers is if you go in and say, we want to speak to you about equity within the system, every person is going to give you lip service to a yes. But what that means to say, like, you know, a legislator who represents the suburbs who would say, yeah, you know, we give a lot in tax dollars because we have high property taxes. And so we just kind of expect an even distribution of all dollars, you know. So imagine, you know, there are 1 million kids in the system. We just want the same for our kids as kids in other districts. But, you know, if you are some, you know, a teacher or a legislator or anyone who works in an urban system where, for example, you might have far more kids, you know, who are second language learners, we recognize that it costs more to educate those kids to the same standard. And so, you know, I might be a suburban legislator talking about equity and saying, let's just keep things even. And, you know, and my people contribute more in tax dollars. Well, that's not equity if we're trying to get everyone to the same high standard. And so I think this is a place where, you know, we really need to dig in on the concept. And as we talk to teachers about advocacy, make sure that they push harder than kind of a baseline, oh, sure, I care about equity. So let's go on, you know, and I think this ties, I'll just say a little bit, I think this ties to teacher quality because we, you know, in schools, the vast majority of budgets go to teacher salaries. And so, you know, it's often the case that you see policymakers saying, how do we take that big pot of money that's going to teachers and make sure we're using it as efficiently as possible? And that has led to lots and lots of different challenges over the course of the very recent past. All right, so the next one, is it good for kids is the wrong question. Anyone have any guesses as to what I mean by that? Okay, so let me just start by asking, you know, is having access to free breakfast and lunch for kids that are hungry good, right? I'm sure everyone would say yes. Is having access to technology so kids can be prepared to, oh, whose kids is a good question for sure. Is that access to technology so kids can be prepared for the kind of century they're moving into a good thing? Absolutely, right? Is having access to, you know, newer curricular materials and, you know, PD for teachers. Access for teachers. Oh yeah, is it seeing the forest through the trees? Yes, yes, that's where we're going. You know, so there are an infinite number of things and supports and ways we can invest in people that at an absolute level are good for kids. And so the challenge really is, and this is where I think teachers have the greatest struggle, is moving from absolute value to relative value. All of the things that I mentioned have value and could be good for kids. The challenge is we can never do all of them to the extent that we would need to be able to be fully successful, right? And so because resource scarcity is a defining feature of policy, and this is a place where teachers really don't have that much experience, we need to kind of really push teachers to think about trade-offs, think in terms of trade-offs. If I do this, I probably can't do that. So at an absolute value level, just about everything could be helpful and good for kids in schools. But the job and the hard part of policy is that policymakers have to say yes to some things and no to other things and try to figure out which are the supports that have the greatest relative value. So does that make sense? So that's what we're asking legislators, that's what we're asking people at the State Department of Education who kind of float the first budget to do. So let's see, we have a comment that says, our state continues to define policy funding as either about oh, interesting, yeah. So I think, you know, so because half of state tax dollars in most states, and I think it's not the case that it's that high in Colorado, but it is in most, go to public education. There's this challenge of, you know, every other line in the state budget is trying to eat into the education budget. So, you know, transportation and infrastructure and all of those things. If there's a place to try to take a bite, it's usually public education, because that absorbs such a large amount of the state budget. And so that's a concern. Let's see, I've got a rapid fire of questions and comments now. So yeah, so I think what I'm saying is the question is not, is it good for kids? The question really is this the best investment for kids on a relative scale? So, so let's see. Yes, and then I think Corey says value equals what? I think this is where things go off the rails. It precisely is. I think that, you know, right now we have gone through a decade of saying, you know, what we're trying to accomplish in schools is raise test scores, and we've realized that's kind of an inadequate diagnosis of the problem. And, you know, so what are we trying to do, and how would we demonstrate to legislators that we need additional funding for schools because of, you know, X measures? And, you know, I think we're in a challenging place right now. Thank you so much, Carrie. All right. So then the last point I'll make in this triangle is, so the job of a legislator is to make these hard decisions about what to fund and what not to. And they really do. We want them to be asking hard questions about, you know, what's working and what's not. And, you know, so this notion of accountability that I think has gotten, we have really kind of corrupted what it means. We are over testing and are trying to roll back from that. But the idea is the right idea. So if I'm, you know, if I'm allocating dollars to education, I want to make sure I'm allocating them in the best possible way. I have to ask what's working, what's not, how do we know? That's one of the hard pieces of the job of a policymaker. Let's see. Let me pause. So this is, so when I say effective advocates think inside the triangle, what I'm saying is, to me, policy boils down to kind of answering these three questions. You know, how do we make sure all kids in the system get a good education? How do we do it with scarce dollars? And how do we know how do we try to figure out what's working? That's what's hard about a policymaker's job. And if I'm a teacher trying to advocate for new policies, I'm trying to think about how do I fit my ideas through the center of that triangle to the extent that I can, recognizing that these are the things going on in a policymaker's brain. Yes, and totally. I think great comment. Policymakers don't always know how to ask good questions to determine accountability standards. Yes, or determine if they've been met. That's totally true, and definitely a challenge.
I'd like to add to that and say that it's not just policymakers, but if we're gonna, you have to put outcomes and use language that's accessible for all audiences, to include legislators, policymakers, parents, and your administrators as well. You have to speak the language that everybody can understand. Yeah.
I think that's definitely exactly right. All right, just checking on our time. All right, so a few more points that I think are important. So number one, and this is a little controversial. I think Cassie was the one who just had to run, but I would say this is one that, you know, that unions kind of would push back on, right? Oh, I'm muted? Can you put thumbs up if you can hear me? I didn't mute myself. Okay, all right. Okay, good. I'm a little scattered with the chat box. Okay, good. I think it might just be, yeah, it looks like people can hear me. All right, so so next point is there's no such thing as one best policy for all. You know, again, I would say this is one where I've had some kind of, I think, healthy debate with unions about this. So the idea of a union is essentially, you know, we do represent all, and, you know, seniority-based systems are, you know, can be a positive if we have teachers who are staying in the field forever. You wait your turn. But I think that when you talk to legislators, they kind of very readily acknowledge that, you know, there are different constituencies within teaching, and maybe we need to do more to keep our young teachers by, you know, helping them to accelerate up a pay schedule more quickly, or offering teacher leadership opportunities to teachers who are, you know, further lower on in their careers, earlier on in their careers. And so it's just kind of important to acknowledge that there are winners and losers in every policy. If you look at kind of the idea of doing a career ladder versus the kind of traditional seniority-based system, in a career ladder system, you know, that is kind of privileging early career teachers to say, you don't have to wait until you're in year 20 in your career to be higher up the salary schedule. But the trade-off of that is, you know, it changes the expectations for more senior teachers and the level of performance they would need to achieve to be able to be paid at the top of the salary schedule. So this is one that just helping teachers to kind of see more broadly than the way that they might have thought about that, I think is important, and to just kind of be able to think about what is in my best interest, and then also what is in the best interest of my students, of my entire profession. Those things are really kind of fraught conversations, but we did a lot of that at Teach Plus and do a lot of that at Teach Plus because, you know, things are changing outside of teaching. There is, you know, less value on seniority. And so, you know, so that's an important conversation. When I started Teach Plus in 2007, we did some research right around that time that showed that the profession had just reached a tipping point where more than 50% of teachers had less than 10 years experience. I think that number now is like, you know, over 65% of teachers have less than 10 years experience. And so thinking about the needs of that kind of millennial generation mostly is important. You know, we have a lot of kind of vestiges of the way that baby boomers built the profession as they built unions for the first time, or in the way that they are now in the 60s and 70s and 80s. Any comments there? All right. A next point is just, you know, that entry points are often hidden in plain sight, and it's often the larger context, things beyond education that end up really kind of influencing what is possible and what are these kind of like important moments in education. So I started Teach Plus in 2007. I kind of started it with a hypothesis that teachers needed a voice in policy, and also that there was kind of an emerging voice of this kind of generational transition that was happening in teaching at that time. Just after I started Teach Plus, there was this article started coming out like crazy. It was the primaries for the 2008 elections, and there were articles that were saying, hey, for the first time, teachers are breaking ranks with what their unions are telling them to do. They're voting for this new guy, Obama, over Hillary, who was the kind of candidate of the unions. And so this notion of young teachers for Obama, old teachers for Hillary, all of a sudden, you know, foundations across the country were talking about who's working with those young teachers, and I was the only one. So my little education thing really got accelerated by the larger political context. Race to the Top was the same kind of thing, like all of these sweeping changes, Common Core, teacher evaluation, all that assessment stuff got swept in because of the Great Recession of 2008. So this, you know, stock market and housing crisis really changed education for a decade. Same thing with charter schools in New Orleans. So Hurricane Katrina basically washed away the education system, and this created this entry point for a lot of kind of entrepreneurial kind of charter school leaders to swoop in and say, we have a solution for this moment. And so we're always talking to teachers about be cognizant of the larger political context and what that might mean for an issue that you care about, because oftentimes it's those larger pieces of context that actually create opportunity zones for changing policy. I think that this has been, you know, the teachers who have led strikes around the country have been brilliant about saying, you know, this is the right moment, and how do we, you know, we saw the teachers in Oklahoma or West Virginia, and we're going to hop on this in Colorado or Arizona and kind of seize this moment that is larger than just our local context. questions or comments? Okay. Oh, say more about the, I'm very interested. So one of the courses I teach is called Teacher Voice and the Labor Movement. So I have been following the strikes really closely as best I possibly can from Boston. I have done some webinars like this with teachers in Arizona who are leading the strikes, but I'd love to hear your take. Do you mean that fewer teachers are applying to, or fewer students are applying to teacher education programs? Just, okay. Well, anyone who wants to weigh in on that, I'd love to hear. Jeremiah had mentioned the strikes were not good for teacher education. Okay. And then the last point that I make in the book is just, you know, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. So, so I think that, ooh, I'm going to pause this one and just say, biased as I think the union is reprehensible. Yeah, oh, interesting. Yes, bullying of non-striking teachers was intense. And yes, pre-service teachers were put off of education because of it. Yeah, I think, you know, I think we're in a really difficult moment right now. At Teach Plus, we sometimes worked with the union and sometimes, you know, kind of went head to head with the union. And I'd be happy to talk about that after I finish this slide. You know, I think my point of view has always been that, you know, we need some outside pushing for the unions to change and be more responsive to the times that we're in. And so I'm interested to see where things go. I do think that one of the things that seems to be happening is there's a younger set of leaders emerging. I'm not so sure that they are going to be that radically different from their predecessors, and that I think might be a problem. So, so last point is, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. You know, I think teachers tend to be very collaborative by nature, very relationship driven by nature. Policy is, you know, kind of an environment of competition for ideas, for votes. And so, you know, we spell that out directly to teachers and say, you know, if this is the slice of the pie, you know, in the state budget that goes to education, there are all sorts of other issues that are competing for those dollars, and you really need to be crisp and smart and bring evidence to your case, as well as tell really compelling stories, and really think from that system perspective. Think about, you know, basically competing for those dollars because schools and children need them. All right. So I will stop my talk there, and just want to kind of open things up for a little bit more conversation. Happy to kind of field any questions. And yes, so Corey said, you know, as far as the strikes go, and as far as bringing teachers into the profession, into pre-service programs, increasing salaries and raising the professional profile of the profession will help. That is certainly true. And, you know, one of the things that I have tried to do with teachers is say, one of the questions that legislators and other policymakers always ask is, what would teachers be held accountable for? What, you know, what can we look at to know whether, you know, we're doing well in our education system? And, you know, yes, the answer can't be just tests. So I try to put it on teachers to say, what would it be? Because a profession owns the challenges of the field. The profession kind of articulates, you know, like this is, if you look at medicine, you know, you have medical boards and you have to be able to pass those boards, and you have to be able to, you know, demonstrate continuing education. All of those things are, you know, a little bit more slippery in teaching. So here's another one. They said crying in your office because how they were treated by the union. Yes, I think that's exactly true. Yeah, and so thank you. Yes, that's, you know, what we've tried to do with Teach Plus is say, you know, let's try to, you know, find teachers who are serving kids well, who are more solutions oriented. I think that has been one of the things that that I think teachers like about Teach Plus. Oftentimes unions can become the place where the people who, have filed a lot of grievances end up hanging out. And so Teach Plus, we've tried to do a little bit more of like, teachers should be driving solutions. Teachers should recognize that accountability is always going to be on the table, should be thinking about dollars and where they're spent. The more teachers can have a command of these things, the more they're going to get listened to. Mm-hmm. Yes, and I think as far as the strikes go, I hope was motivating to teachers to see that they can be a catalyst for change. Very curious to see where it leads from there. And I think sometimes we do have to say it has to be about more than money in the long term, although money, I think, is a significant issue right now in lots of places, including lots of places in Colorado.
But an opportunity for them to use their voice and see it be successful.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. Thank you for sending that about Teach Plus. Other comments and questions?
I'm wondering, Celine, if you can give an example of when you've seen like a Teach Plus fellow or maybe even someone else, just a success experience with advocating for themselves or the profession.
Oh, yes. There are lots. I think, let me give like three. So the very first one that I ever worked on way back when was, it was a group of fellows in Boston, and there were a set of schools that had been deemed low performing, and basically they came up with a teacher leadership strategy for those schools that attracted some really great teachers to the schools. That kind of program was able to, it exists in Boston. It has scaled to, it exists now also in Philadelphia and also in Indianapolis. And it's a really great model of teacher leadership that was developed by teachers, that has been improved over time by teachers, and really focused on a career pathway, good training for the leadership dimensions that teachers are charged with, basically leading their grade level group in their elementary school, and has really gotten some good results across multiple cities. So that, I think, is a really nice example. Right now in Indianapolis, we have a Teach Plus teacher who has just created a breakaway union. And so like a kind of more professional association of teachers. The union in Indianapolis is fairly weak and has been kind of under investigation forever for basically financial malfeasance. And so this teacher, who has been active in the union, but also active in Teach Plus, has now basically pulled most of the active union members into a whole new union that is organized around a kind of more professional set of principles. So I think that that's fantastic. And then I think teachers, including in Colorado, another place is in Illinois, have been really active in school finance and bills in the state legislature around fixing school finance formulas and ensuring adequate funding for schools.
Great.
Yes, and definitely you should talk to Mark Sass, who can tell you much more.
Yeah, that's great. So there was a question, Celine, if there was like one or two kind of issues that Teach Plus is particularly paying attention to in Colorado.
Yes, I think so. I think the two biggest ones are this question of, and the reframing teacher evaluation. So I think our point of view, and Mark would share this, is there needs to be some system of kind of identifying professional competence and development. So an evaluation system that has multiple measures, that includes a lot of observation. There needs to be something in place to to kind of have, like, to be the scaffold for what a profession is, who's doing well, what areas can people develop in. And so kind of getting that right from the very kind of hard line beginnings that go back to Race to the Top, I think is where we are now in a lot of places, including Colorado, that it needs to be a pretty broad system. It needs to be a pretty flexible system, but it needs to exist. And that is a cornerstone to being able to build career ladders, build, leadership opportunities. And so that has always been kind of an important piece of work for Teach Plus, and I think it has been in Colorado as well. And then a second one has been around funding and funding formulas, both in Colorado and in other parts of the country, to try to get those things right. A third is the question of assessment. From my point of view, I have always said to teachers that I think that student assessment is something that is a solvable problem in policy. We went overboard in the kind of too much, and we, I think, stopped just short of the finish line around saying, how do you get a reasonable set of measures that don't take up too much student time, don't have too much prep involved with them. Although I think good prep is just baked into the way that you teach. And so that kind of push to get assessment right has been something that we've done a lot of, and I think have made a difference on. This is a place where in Massachusetts, we did actually go head to head with the union, because the union was basically in a moment where we were potentially switching the state test. What Teach Plus decided to do, which I think is kind of a more professional approach, if you will, was to say, okay, let's look at the standards. And then, and you kind of sit with a table of teachers that are at your grade level and subject, grab the have a copy of the standards, and then look at the different test items on the two different proposed tests and weigh in on which you think is actually better for the types of things you'd like to see as a teacher, which assesses critical thinking skills, which, assesses the types of things you're teaching in your classroom, and weigh in that way. So we did that with, with like a couple thousand teachers in Massachusetts. The union's approach was to say, in this moment of deciding on a test, we're going to try to galvanize teachers around ending testing in the state. Of course, that's not a state decision, that's a federal decision, but they were able to galvanize lots of teachers to have a voice on the issue. But of course, they weren't able to kind of eliminate testing. So testing is one where we've been in some controversial places, and I think my point of view, and I think oftentimes those who work in the organization would say, this is something we can get right. There needs to be less testing. It needs to be targeted, but let's keep on that track, because it's important to know if kids are learning.
Great. Anyone else have questions for Celine?
Thank you all. This was really fun.
Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it, and we appreciate this good information, and we'll pass it on to candidates all across the state, I hope. And thank you for participating.
Corey, I'll send you my slides. You can use my slides. You can do anything you want. I mean, to me, this is like 1 hour of an ed prep program, and if you want to just like take it wholesale, please do.
Great. Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone.
Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.